Principles of Potash Nutrition by Ian Matz from the Potash Development Association. This presentation will cover the following topics: an introduction to PDA, the role of potassium in crop production, a brief overview of the potassium cycle, and principles of potassium recommendations. Introduction to the PDA. The Potash Development Association is an independent service providing information to support the correct use of potash in UK agriculture. This is achieved through the website, presentations to groups of students, farmers and advisors, phone and email support, leaflets on a range of topics that are available to download from the website, quarterly newsletters and periodic technical emails. This is all provided free of charge. Introduction. Potassium is a common element, about 7th in order of abundance in the Earth's crust. Although it is widely distributed in many rocks, its concentration is often small. However, salt deposits which were laid down hundreds of millions of years ago are often complex mixtures containing potassium, sodium and magnesium. In the global cycling of potassium, this is first mined and then refined. As potassium fertilizer, it is applied to agricultural soils, taken up by plants, and it enters the human food chain. It is transferred to sewage treatment works, and because it is almost entirely water soluble, it is discharged in the effluent to watercourses and from there back to the sea. So the use of potassium fertilizer is part of a very long global cycle. Potassium salts are products of nature. They can have a variety of colors caused by the trapping of tiny quantities of impurities, such as clay and iron compounds, as the deposits were laid down. The role of potassium. Potassium is the main cation in the sap and fruits. It's involved in many metabolic processes and osmoregulation. In practice, this means it's important for turgor pressure and standing power, drought, cold and disease resistance, transport of anions and sugars around the plant, and efficient use of nitrogen. Water regulation. Potassium is the plant-preferred ion for maintaining the water content and hence the turgor or rigidity of each cell. A large concentration of potassium in the cell sap causes water to move into the cell by osmosis through the porous cell wall. As water flows into the cell, it causes them to swell, putting pressure on cell walls to help maintain a rigid and upright structure for plants. Turgid cells maintain the least vigor, so that photosynthesis proceeds efficiently. Plants that are short on potassium are less efficient at regulating water, as the osmotic potential is reduced, and therefore less water flows into cells. This can result in flaccid cells which lose shape and are less capable of maintaining turgor pressure, which is more likely to result in lodging. Drought tolerance. Related to the role of water regulation is the impact of potassium on drought tolerance. Plants depend on potassium to regulate the opening and closing of leaf stomates. These are the tiny apertures on the underside of leaves. The stomata are important for allowing the movement of carbon dioxide into the plant whilst releasing oxygen. The plant regulates the opening and closing of the stomata through movement of potassium into or out of the guard cells. When potassium moves into these cells, they accumulate water as a result of their higher salt concentrations, via osmosis, and therefore swell, opening the pores. If potassium levels within the plant are low, the stomata become slow to respond and do not close as quickly, resulting in the loss of water vapor and a reduced photosynthetic rate. Photosynthesis is the process by which plants capture light energy to convert carbon dioxide and water into carbohydrates, such as sugars, required for growth and building yield. The rate of photosynthesis therefore dictates the efficiency of the production of sugars and ultimately crop yield and quality. Plants subjected to stresses, such as moisture stress, considerably reduce photosynthetic rates, reducing the efficiency of carbohydrate production, resulting in lower yield. Photosynthetic rates are maintained in potassium-sufficient plants through efficient stomatal activity. This graph demonstrates the net photosynthesis of wheat leaves subjected to varied drought stress and potassium supply. Cold tolerance. The formation of ice crystals within plants at low temperatures can destroy plant cells. Plants try to protect themselves against this by storing osmotically effective substances such as sugar and potassium within their cells. Both of these substances serve as antifreeze agents, as they lower the cell's sap's freezing point, thereby maintaining cell functionality. Deeply frozen soil also prevents plants from absorbing sufficient moisture. Plants are most at risk when evaporation rates are high from sunny and windy weather. A lack of moisture in this circumstance can be detrimental to plants. Potassium helps to protect against this by regulating the plant's water balance, as previously discussed, preventing uncontrolled loss of water through the leaves. The results in the table show the impact of potassium application on the proportion of oilseed rape plants showing damage from cold temperatures. Disease resistance. Plant resistance to disease is genetically controlled, as can be seen from the tables in the AHDB recommended list. However, it can also be considerably influenced by environmental factors, such as nutrient levels available to plants. Potassium has an essential role in plant disease and pest resistance, and is possibly the most effective of all the nutrients. It is a regulator of enzyme activity, and therefore involved in nearly all cellular functions that influence disease severity. There are two primary resistance mechanisms that nutrition impacts on. Firstly, the formation of mechanical barriers, and secondly, the synthesis of defense compounds, such as phytoalexins. Looking at the formation of mechanical barriers, potassium is required for the synthesis of cellulose, which is a component of cell walls. Cellulose acts as a mechanical barrier to invasion and infection. Potassium deficiency reduces cellulose production, leading to thinner cell walls with less resistance to infection. As a rule, susceptibility to disease decreases in response to potassium in the same way that plant growth responds to increasing potassium supply, as can be seen in the graph. Beyond optimal supply for growth, there are no further benefits from additional potassium in terms of plant health. So if the soil supply is adequate for growth, such as at index 2-, then the supply for defense against disease and pests is adequate. Regarding the synthesis of defense compounds, just as humans produce antibodies after infection, plants have a similar defense mechanism when infected by a pathogen. The infection causes increased production of certain chemicals that form part of the plant's defense mechanism. The potassium status of a plant is important for both the production and the transport of these compounds to the site of infection. Shortages reduce the amount of natural antifungal compounds, increasing the plant's susceptibility to disease once it has penetrated the cells. Potassium and nitrogen interactions. The improvement of nitrogen use efficiency, particularly in cereals, is a major goal of crop improvement. Such improved crops would make better use of the nitrogen fertilizer supplied. They would also produce higher yields with better protein content. This might be achieved at least in part by a better understanding of nitrogen metabolism and its regulation. Potassium helps improve both the uptake of nitrogen from the soil and the conversion of nitrogen in the plant to amino acids and ultimately protein. In nutrient solution studies, higher rates of potassium allowed for the efficient use of more nitrogen, which resulted in better early vegetative growth and higher grain and straw yields as potassium and nitrogen rates increased. Crops respond to higher potassium levels when nitrogen is sufficient, and greater yield response to nitrogen fertilizer occurs when potassium is sufficient. When 4 rates of nitrogen were tested on high and low potassium soils, there was a large difference in the response of spring barley, as these results from Rothamsted research show. Average yields plateaued at 50 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare for the barley grown on soil with only 55 milligrams per kilogram of exchangeable K. A greater yield response was measured when the soils contained adequate amounts of exchangeable K, with the optimum nitrogen rate increasing to 96 kilograms a hectare. Potassium cycle. Where is it? Potassium exists as K plus ion for plant nutrition in soil moisture, on cation exchange sites, and inside potassic minerals. The cation exchange sites in soil typically refers to the clay and organic matter. Potassium in soil can be thought of as existing in 4 pools, according to their availability of K for uptake by plant roots. It is present dissolved in the soil water, absorbed onto particles of clay and organic matter, and held within the layers of clay particles. Only small amounts of K are maintained in soil solution, approximately 6 to 24 kilograms K2O. The majority of potassium reserves in the soil are held by the negative charges on clay minerals and organic matter. The potassium may be held weakly or strongly according to the position in the clay lattice. Potassium that is loosely held, the readily available K, is rapidly released for plant uptake, whilst the more firmly bonded reserve, the less readily available K, is released more slowly. Plant roots take up potassium as the cation K+ from soil solution, and it is this plus the readily available K which is measured by soil analysis as being potentially available to the crop. Together, these pools can be described as the exchangeable K. The less readily available K is potassium that has been retained within soil minerals from previous applications of fertilizers and manures, or has been released from native soil minerals by weathering. This pool of K is difficult to measure in the laboratory and is not usually determined for advisory purposes. However, field and glasshouse experiments have shown that K in this pool is slowly available to crops and is a vital source of potassium. The very slowly available K, or mineral matrix K, is the K in native soil minerals such as feldspars and micas. Some soils contain lots of these minerals and some very little. The clay content of the soil is not a reliable guide as to the type of mineral. Potassium in the soil minerals is only very slowly released by weathering, and the amounts available each year are not sufficient to supply the needs of crop cultivars with a large yield potential. The essential feature of this concept of the behavior of soil K is its reversible transfer between the exchangeable and less readily available pools. Thus, when K is added in fertilizers and manures, it goes first into soil solution, from where it is taken up by plant roots. Some of the K is then absorbed onto the exchange sites, where it is readily available for release back into soil solution. From these exchange sites, K can move to be within the silicate layers that constitute the soil minerals. Here the K becomes part of the less readily available pool of K. However, when K is in demand by the growing crop, this K can be released back into the soil solution for uptake by plant roots. The speed and extent of the transfer of K between these pools and the factors that control the transfer are of special concern, especially as farmers stop applying potash. The basis of the index system and target soil levels. Trial work conducted at Rothamsted Research through the 1960s and 70s helped to identify the target levels at which to maintain soil K. They showed that on many soils, potash reserves which accumulated from applications of fertilizers and organic manures increased crop yields compared to those obtained on similar soils, but without such reserves. Also, applying fresh potassium fertilizer to the K-deficient soil did not increase crop yields to equal those obtained on a soil with an adequate amount of available K. They also identified that there was no need to continually build up reserves. The yield response curve to potassium supply follows the same principle as for other inputs. At very low levels of available soil K, the response to applied potash is large, and this response decreases as soil supply increases. Target levels for soil K, which represent the level at which K supply is adequate for full yield but not excessive, have been established from large numbers of response experiments for different crops. The K index at which yield is close to the maximum can be considered the critical value. Below this, the loss of yield is a financial loss to the farmer. Above it, there is no justification for further increase in available K. Current recommendations for potash on arable soils are to maintain the soil at K index 2- for most crops, and at K index 2+ for potatoes and vegetables. If the crop rotation on an individual field has a significant proportion of potatoes and vegetables, the soil should be maintained around K index 2+. This is because the potash fertilization policy should apply to the whole rotation of crops on the farm, and therefore soil fertility should be maintained. Potassium uptake. Potash uptake during establishment is low, with winter wheat typically containing around 40 to 50 kilograms of K2O per hectare over winter, and more forward winter barley crops up to 80 kilograms of K2O per hectare. As a crop reaches tillering and starts to make vigorous vegetative growth, potash and nitrogen uptake increase very rapidly. Potash uptake may be as high as 10 kilograms per hectare per day, and on light, low potash soils, this may outpace the soil's natural capability to supply. Peak potash uptake in cereal occurs around late flowering stage, when there may be more than 300 kilograms of K2O a hectare in a high-yielding crop. Peak uptake of potash is much greater than offtake at harvest. If this peak requirement is not available, grain number and grain fill will be affected, thus limiting both yield and quality. This is a key reason for maintaining the adequate soil reserves which can supply these peak amounts more reliably than fresh fertilizer applications. After flowering, potash is redistributed around the plant with a general reduction from leaves to grain and stem bases. Potash is also returned to the soil with the senescence of older leaves. The rate at which this potash redistribution occurs varies widely with different seasons and affects potash levels in straw. Principles of potash recommendations. When soils are at an adequate K index for the rotation, it should be maintained by replacing the amount of K removed in the harvested crop. This can be calculated from the yield and the concentration of K in the crop. The latter can be found in tables published in the Fertilizer Manual or in PDA leaflet phosphate and potash removals by crop. These published K concentrations are averages, so it may be that slightly too much or too little will be applied as a maintenance or replacement dressing each year. Consequently, it is sensible to check that potash applications are maintaining the correct level of plant available K in the soil. This can be done by taking a soil sample every 4 to 5 years from each field for analysis. Preferably, sampling should always be done at the same point in the rotation and at the same time of year and to the same depth. Where soils are below the target index, applications should be made above that of maintenance alone to raise the index over time to the target level. Where soils are already above the target index, applications can be reduced or omitted to lower the index. The adjustments built into the Fertilizer Manual are based on making a change to the index over a 10 to 15-year time period. The rates can be adjusted to make the amendment over a shorter time period, or the PDA's PK calculator can be used to select the number of years. The calculator can be found on the PDA website and is also available to download as an app for both Android and Apple. It should be recognized that potash is unlike most other farm inputs, which are justified on the basis of direct yield response and financial return per pound spent. Correct use of potash to replace crop offtake and maintain soil reserves may not result in an immediate yield response. Failure to replace the potassium removed in the crop and maintain an adequate soil reserve jeopardizes future yields and crop quality and unnecessarily exposes the response to all other inputs. Policies for the lightest textured soils, sands and loamy sands, should be to ensure at least the replacement of removals without the expectation of raising the inherently low levels of soil K to the same value as for other soils. Fertilizer calculations. Once a total nutrient requirement has been calculated, it is necessary to turn this into a fertilizer recommendation for application. The first step is to take into account any contributions from organic manures where they're available to work out the fertilizer nutrient requirement. This can then be converted into a fertilizer application rate by taking the analysis of the fertilizer being used into account. P&K and organic manures. The total amount of P&K supplied by organic manures will vary depending on the manure type. There are tables in the Fertilizer Manual or the PDA leaflet on organic manures which show these figures. It is important to understand that not all of the P&K supplied by organic manures is available to the following crop, and therefore the available figures are also important to take into account. This will also vary by manure type, but is typically 50 to 60% for phosphate and 90% for potash. When crop responses to applied P&K are expected, i.e. the soil is below target, or a responsive crop is being grown, such as potatoes, to phosphate, then the available P&K figures should be accounted for. When soils are at or above the target index, the application can be considered a rotational one to maintain indices, and therefore the total P&K figures should be used. Potassium applications. Potassium can be supplied through either fertilizers or organic manures. Fertilizer products can be either straights, which are predominantly single nutrient products. Two examples of potassium are murate of potash, MOP, which is typically 60% potassium, or sulfate of potash, SOP, which is typically 50% potassium. MOP is more widely used as this is a cheaper source of potassium. It also contains chloride, which is not an issue on broadacre arable crops in the UK as chloride is mobile in soils and the levels of rainfall means it never builds up to toxic levels to cause harm to crops. Potassium can also be supplied as a combination of other nutrients, in compounds or in blends. Compounds contain all the nutrients within the same granule or prill, whereas blends are mixes of typically straight products within the same bag. This is typically MOP for potassium that will be used for these products. As mentioned previously, many organic manures will also contain potassium. However, sewage sludge, although being high in phosphate, does not provide very much in the way of potassium. Timing of application. Timing of application will depend on the crop being grown and the soil index, but would typically be either at planting or in the spring. Where soil indices are at target level, timing is less critical. But where soil indices are low, placement applications at planting can prove beneficial, particularly for phosphate, which is in high demand during the early stages of establishment. This is typically less common for potassium due to the presence of chloride in MOP. However, other sources of potash, such as polysulfate, provide a source of potassium without chloride. Thank you for going through this presentation on the principles of potash nutrition. If you'd like any more information, please visit the website at www.pda.org.uk or email info@pda.org.uk or follow us on Twitter at @pda_potash.